The RGB to HDMI project is my favorite solution so far that allows us to use this modern LCD instead of this original one on the Amstrad PPC. Today, I'm going to do some investigating about this setup and learn a bunch of cool stuff along the way. Hello and welcome back to Noel's Retro Lab. After watching the video about using the RGB to HDMI project with a Raspberry Pi Zero to replace the LCD of the Amstrad PPC, a lot of you had some very good questions. So let's dig into some details and answer those questions right now. Some of you asked if you can still connect an external video monitor while we have the RGB to HDMI board connected. This is not an unreasonable question at all, because each video device has a certain resistance associated with it, and when you connect multiple devices at the same time, you're putting those resistances in parallel and dropping the voltage of the signals. So the question is, will that drop prevent us from connecting an external monitor? Only one way to find out. One important thing is that the dip switches are set up for the external monitor, because we're actually tapping on to the external monitor connector for our RGB to HDMI conversion, so at least that's fine. Since I still don't own a CGA monitor to test this, we're going to use this device again. We saw this a few episodes ago. This is a very simple CGA to SCART RGB converter, and there's minimal logic in there, so there's nothing fancy. There shouldn't be even any signal amplifiers or anything like that, so this should give us a pretty good idea. Okay, this is powered, so let's turn it on and give it a try. It's okay that it still says no signal. It takes a few seconds for the PPC to get started. We'll hear the beep, and then we should be able to see the message. There you go, beep, boom, there we go. So it does work perfectly fine. Now, one interesting thing that you may have noticed is that we saw the image first in the big screen, in the external screen, and it took several seconds for it to show up on the LCD. And that's actually the only big problem that I've seen so far of this particular configuration. And I don't think it's the Raspberry Pi, I think it's the LCD itself. It seems like when you switch modes, it takes a couple of seconds and it's blank, and then it finally switches to whatever new video mode it is. That's less than ideal, but I'm willing to live with it. It would be great if we found a solution that it didn't have that, but that's okay for now. Another really good question was, how long does it take for the Raspberry Pi to start up? After all, we're adding a computer to a computer, so things can get messy, right? If you've ever seen a Raspberry Pi booting into Raspbian, its native operating system, you'll understand this question. It's not as slow as a PC booting for the first time, but it's not trivial. As a matter of fact, I just tested it with a Raspberry Pi 3 and the latest Raspberry OS, and it came up to a full 26 seconds. So that would definitely be a problem. But is that the case for our Raspberry Pi? Let's have a look. Let's open it up and let's connect the external monitor directly to the Raspberry Pi. So I'm unplugging the internal LCD and plugging in the external monitor. Just to be able to time things correctly, I've hooked up the power of the laptop to a power strip. So as soon as I turn it on in here, the computer, and meaning the Raspberry Pi, will turn on. And so we'll see how long it takes for the image to show up in the external monitor. And so let's go. Okay, you saw that rainbow pattern. I think that means the Raspberry Pi finished booting up. Or at the very least, that was something that it does during boot up. So that was really quickly. In order to really know when the Raspberry Pi is ready, what I'm going to do is I'm going to re-enable the boot message. So when it boots up, it prints out some information, and that way we'll know at that point it really is ready and generating an image already. So we're going to do it again, and let's see how long it takes for that message to show up. Rainbow and message right there. So that was really fast. Certainly way faster than the PPC. Still hasn't beeped. Which now it's beeping. So that is not an issue at all, the boot up time for the Raspberry Pi. And why is that?
The reason the Raspberry Pi running RGB to HDMI boots up in just 4 seconds is because it's a bare metal application. It doesn't use Raspberry OS or any other Linux flavor. Instead, it's programmed to talk directly with the Raspberry Pi hardware, making it much faster to start up.
But probably the most asked question of all of them was, can you please replace that cable? So there are a couple things wrong with this cable. First of all, just how big it is and how much space it takes, completely unnecessarily. But then this is just your typical HDMI cable. I didn't learn of the existence of ribbon HDMI cables until right after this project. So yes, that would be a much better fit. It will even be easier for the cable to come out of the bezel of the LCD. And so here it is. This is the right size. I think it's perfect size. This is 50 centimeters. And see how thin it is. Now, is the shielding going to be enough? I hope so. We're about to find out. As you can see, this was a really tight fit in this part, and then this is digging a little bit into the cable itself. So I'm glad we have a thinner cable. Oh, such much better fit. Now this is much easier to fit in there as well, so yeah, this is great. So yeah, this reaches perfectly fine. If anything, we have still a little too much slack. So hopefully something like this is good enough. It seems to be mostly tucked out of the way. Maybe I'll have to put a little tie or something at some point. Let's try it that way. And for those of you that are also somewhat OCD about certain things, like I am, you would notice that in this is the second board that I built. The first one I couldn't get to work initially, and then I fixed it. And in this one, I took more care of the passive components. So they're all nicely aligned where they're supposed to be. So yes, that will make us all feel much better. Okay, and let's test it. Oh, one thing I noticed right away is that this moves up and down much more easily than before. Before, it was a little stiff. So that thick cable was definitely adding some resistance to that. So that's definitely nicer, much more how it used to be. Oh yeah, still need to turn off the boot message. And there we go. And it looks really good. I don't see any weird distortion or interference or anything. Awesome.
And by the way, I took advantage of having to open the case of the screen to actually center it correctly. Last time I had left it a little bit off center, so now I believe it's pretty much perfect.
Also, another very good point that I completely didn't mention last time was how much lag does the Raspberry Pi introduce? After all, we have something that's scanning the video signal in real time, sampling it, and generating its own video signal. That's not something that's instantaneous, and it can really affect how it feels to use the computer. Some slight lag can make playing games uncomfortable, and more lag can even make typing feel very sluggish and cumbersome. The project webpage says that it introduces about 4 milliseconds, and since one frame is 20 milliseconds, that seems really good. But as usual, whenever we have questions, let's actually measure them. So what I'm going to do to minimize any other issues for now is I'm just going to look at how long it takes between the time I press a key and the time we see the character appear in MS-DOS. I'm assuming this is going to be one of the ways with least amount of lag as opposed to trying to press forward and the character of Prince of Persia and have it move forward. And I don't know how much delay is there involved in that, but I'm assuming that typing on the keyboard is going to be pretty responsive. So we'll use that as a test initially. For this test, I'm also recording this at 100 frames a second. That way we'll be able to go back and look at it frame by frame, see how much delay there is between the time of me pressing a key and seeing the character there. So what I'm going to do is get my finger as close as I can to the key and then very quickly press it. And then I'll just do it a few times and we'll take the average of those. I mean, it really feels very fast.
So how fast was it? Let's look at one sequence frame by frame. Here, my finger isn't pressing the key yet. And in this one, it's definitely moving down, so I'm going to assume that the key is already triggered. This is going to be frame number 1. In the next frame, my finger is clearly bottomed out, and there's still no 5 appearing on the screen. And remember, this was filmed at 100 frames per second, so each frame is exactly 10 milliseconds. We're up to frame 3 and nothing has changed. Same thing with frame 4. And finally in frame 5, we see that the number appears on the screen. So that's 4 whole frames from key press until the character was displayed, which is about 40 milliseconds or a bit under 2 frames. I measured it a few more times and it was pretty consistently around that time. So that's not horrible, but it's not great either. However, that's not how much lag this setup is introducing. That's the total amount of lag between input and output. How could we isolate just the amount of lag this particular setup is introducing? The ideal solution would be to connect a CGA monitor directly to the output and compare it, but since I still don't have one, I'll use the next best thing and bring the CGA to RGB converter back out and use that. Given that it's not doing any buffering or conversions, I believe that it introduces no lag at all. Also, I'm going to use a CRT TV instead of an LCD one for this test to avoid any extra lag in the LCD processing. As a bonus, I'm able to record both screens at once, so if there's a difference in delays, we'll be able to see it very clearly. Just by looking at it while I was pressing the key, I didn't see any obvious differences, but let's review it frame by frame again. Okay, we'll start in this frame. Notice there's already a 5 on the screen. We're looking for the second one to appear. This is frame 1, where I'm starting to press the key. By frame 2, nothing has changed. But by frame 3, we already have the 5 showing in the CRT TV and not on the LCD. Moving on to frame 4, nothing changes, and frame 5, just like before, the number shows up on the LCD. So from these findings, it looks like the normal lag while typing on the MS-DOS prompt is about 20 milliseconds, which is probably just a single frame, and with our setup, it's about double that, which is 40 milliseconds or about 2 frames. So what's up with that? Was the RGB to HDMI webpage lying about only introducing 4 milliseconds? I don't have a way of knowing for sure, but I'm gonna guess that was correct. Because here we aren't just measuring the lag introduced by RGB to HDMI, but all the lag introduced by the whole setup, which includes also the LCD driver and the LCD itself. In any case, adding a delay of 20 milliseconds or 1 frame, it's totally within reason for just about any application. It seems that modern games have an input lag between 80 and 150 milliseconds, so this is completely minor in comparison. So I'd say the extra lag added by this setup is very reasonable and mostly unnoticeable.
A few of you were asking me whether there were some artifacts on the screen due to sampling. My first thought is like there were some, but I'm thinking that was before I did the auto calibration. Yeah, so here you can go to auto calibrate video sampling, and I think that got rid of a lot of the weird artifacts. So they were most noticeable in vertical lines or vertical text. I'm not seeing anything just by looking at the screen. I don't know if the video will capture some weird interference with the way the image is generated on the LCD, but at plain sight, this looks rock solid. Again, this looks totally fine, vertical lines and everything. And again, here we have a lot of vertical lines, a lot of pixel patterns, and I don't see any shimmering or any interference or anything. This is rock solid. Nobody is going to argue that the original screen was better than this one. But some people pointed out that the visuals of the original screen did have a unique look to them. So would it be possible to emulate that look with RGB to HDMI? As far as I know, there isn't an exact way, because that was kind of a very peculiar screen. It was actually monochrome, like literally it was on or off. It wasn't intermediate shades of green, and so it had some dithering built in and all that. So it may be possible to emulate that if you really want to, but I think that would require modifying the project. But you could probably do that. With what we have right now in the RGB to HDMI menu, what we could do is we can change palettes. We can turn it to monochrome and green. So, this is not what it looked like before, but it's closer. This is actually way better than what it looked like before. And what are some of the other options that we have? In amber, okay, which doesn't look very amber now that I think about it, but it could be an interesting challenge to try to write a new profile for this. I don't think I'm going to be doing that, but if somebody does, I would love to try it out. On the flip side, CGA had a not very well-known composite mode that traded resolution for extra colors. A lot of CGA video cards didn't even support it, and I never even saw it in the wild back in the day. But would it be possible to get that composite video mode with this setup? David, the 8-bit guy, had a great video about it. I'm putting a link to it in the corner right now. He explained how that works and how you can actually get some very interesting palettes and color combinations. I think it's possible to do this. And for that, actually, we're going to use David's game. He very generously donated a copy. Planet X3. Okay, so that's where it looks monochrome, but maybe now we turn on the artifact mode. Oh, there we go, I think. Wow. Who would say those are CGA colors? That looks amazing. So it's a little blurrier, yeah. So because we're running at 160 instead of 320. But then the colors kind of blur together and wow, and creates those artifacts. That looks amazing. And not just very colorful, but the colors are very different than the regular CGA palette. And now does this change the palette? Yeah, check it out. Wow, that grassy area. Yeah, I think that's the way to go. Okay, that is really cool that this project has an option. The Planet X3 has it, it's great, but that rgbtohdmi has that option to emulate this. It's super, super cool. Another very good question that somebody raised is if the LCD driver gets too hot encased like that, where I installed it with the foam and everything. And that's a very good point because the LCD case doesn't have any ventilation holes or anything. Well, let's check right now. This has been running for about an hour. We're gonna check with a laser thermometer. So I guess I'm just gonna get an idea of just room temperature. It should be around 20 degrees right now. It's rather hot. So plastic right now, there is listed at 21.9, 21.8, 22.4, 22. And now I'm gonna check the back of the LCD. Yep, 35, 36, 37, 34. Now this has been, oh, 38. So this has been for an hour running. And it would imagine that 38 is still within reason. I should definitely keep an eye out on that. And if it becomes an issue, maybe I can make just a couple of ventilation slots in there and that might be good enough. Or maybe I need to change the approach of keeping the screen in place and remove that foam, and instead of that, use either glue and have more room for it there to ventilate a little bit, or something else. But I think maybe just a couple of slots might be a good idea. You know, even has them right there, so it would be in keeping with that. But I think for now it's fine. It's certainly not burning, and it's been going on for a while. So I'm not sure how many marathon gaming sessions I'm going to have with this, but it's something to keep in mind. Another very asked question is, now that we have a Raspberry Pi in there, can we remove the original hardware and just emulate it in the Pi? And the answer to that is definitely not. Seriously, I have a lot of plans involving using the Amstrad PPC hardware for different things, and it just wouldn't be any fun just emulating it on the Raspberry Pi. Actually, it would be a little fun, but it would be a lot more fun to use the real hardware. An alternate question involved whether we could use the Raspberry Pi for something else, like a file server, a network adapter, or something like that. And without looking at the specifics, I'm going to guess that the Raspberry Pi is close to being maxed out just doing the video conversion. So I think the answer is no for doing something and still generating the video signal. But hey, there's still a lot of room in there, so we can always add more Raspberry Pis. And finally, another question that a lot of you asked me is where you can buy one of these. Unfortunately, I don't know any places that sell them pre-made, so you'll have to make them yourself. If you don't have the soldering skills, get together with someone who does and do a mini batch of them. Order 5 or 10 PCBs and the components, and you can each have a couple and then sell the others to other users that are interested. A good place to check for other users will be the discussion thread for the project, Twitter, or even the Discord channel for Noel's RetroLab. I think there are enough people interested and it should be pretty easy to make several boards. Well, there you have it. I hope I answered a lot of the questions that you had about this particular setup. I continue being really happy and very impressed with RGB to HDMI project, and I highly recommend it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that episode. See you next time.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting Noel's RetroLab on Patreon or joining the membership on YouTube. Not only is that the best way to support this channel and allow me to continue making more videos, but you also get some extra perks like early access, ad-free videos, and more. Thank you again to all the supporters. See you next time.